Okay, thank you. Yao Graham, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. I would like to address some big challenges facing developing countries in general and African countries in particular in terms of their aspirations for development. What do you see as the major challenges constraining the realization of African development potential?
Well, that question brings me very much to the current excitement about Africa rising. And I think if you look at if you decompose the excitement of Africa rising, a number of things are clear. Uh, a decade of growth at the continental level, uneven at the national level, with a strong commodity boom dimension. What has become clear from this growth also are precisely the limits of the growth model. Okay, a growth model which basically has intensified raw material commodity export dependence, which has also worsened the colonial pattern of integration into the global economy. It seems to me that the primary lesson from that, therefore, is that the a more conscious development choice which confronts the need to break away from this pattern of raw material commodity export dependence. If you look at a number of studies and reports which have come out in recent times, everybody is now talking about structural transformation in Africa. The character of that structural transformation, of course, varies depending on the kind of theoretical orientation of people speaking. But in my view, I think really the issue of structural transformation with equity is quite important. What do I mean by this? I think within that, there are important questions about, say, industrialization. Because the structural transformation which is unfolding on the continent now, you see an expansion of low productivity service sector with a mass of people in it, low informal sector jobs, but with a high end of, say, financial services, and telecom, where a lot of foreign firms are making profits, which are disarticulated from some of the things that will be needed to bring about change, in the real economy. Finance has become decoupled almost from production in a number of important ways. Agricultural productivity in many countries is either stagnant or is moving very slowly. I mean, manufacturing and industrial policy have fallen off the agenda, in many countries. So a return to the centrality of industrialization is something that a lot of people are articulating, but it's still not clear, how exactly that recognition is going to be articulated with how the state organizes itself, with how finance is organized, and also the link between agriculture and industry. These are some, of the key questions. And I think within that, then also some of the questions about, the plans for education, the quality of labor, a number of things which are there, because all these things have become a bit, fragmented and articulated over the past 20 years as countries focused, creating an enabling environment primarily for a raw material based, export-led growth.
One of the big challenges is also the recovery of the agricultural sector. As you know, agriculture collapsed together with the deindustrialization which took place. It is not as if agriculture has thrived, at least until there has been some recovery more recently, but it has not done very well. The problem, of course, is that the presumption of the people who are advocating liberalization and structural adjustment was that that industrialization could not be supported, but in a liberal atmosphere, that Africa would rise to its real comparative advantage, which lay in agriculture, it was presumed. And this also has turned out to be false. But if one simply begins to think of producing, whether agriculture or industry, for the market which exists, and we know that the markets which exist are largely external markets, partly because of the small size of the domestic market in most African countries, what you basically will end up with a situation where success will continue to be measured in terms of output, exports, revenue. rather than in terms of, let us say, meeting the nutrition needs of the African populations. How do we overcome this kind of problem?
You're right when you talk about what has happened to agriculture, and that's the point I was making about the stagnation of productivity or even decline in some areas. We have had these enclaves of agricultural productivity growth as well as production growth, primarily in export areas. So it might be horticulture and flowers in some places, but mainly the export enclave has done very well in terms of agriculture. So it's critically important that agricultural productivity and agriculture as such is given some attention in terms of public investment, public policy and investment strategies, which also kind of dynamize private sector engagement. But the issue of the markets and it's an issue which brings to the fore why the discussion about regional integration is so important in an African context, because the question of over the past 30 years, the intensification of an export-led growth has also had an effect on domestic producers for the domestic and regional markets, who tend to be kind of producers for food or producers of food. But I think if you look at the regional market, you also begin to see possibilities not simply for agricultural revival, but also for manufacturing markets. I mean, if I take Ghana as an example, I mean, Ghanaian light industry, a lot of their export is into the regional market. So Nigeria is a very important destination for Ghanaian exports. Food farmers, there's a lot of cross-border trade because consumption patterns, the items of consumption are very similar. So there are actually synergies and economies to be gained if some of these things are also seen in a kind of regional dimension. Because the scale question, I mean, apart from a few countries which may have a kind of subcontinental size and so on, most African countries, either as economies or as population sizes, are very small. And the integration with the global market is likely to intensify the historic kind of raw material, raw mineral export dependence. A strategy of kind of regional integration, which therefore also informs the trade policy choices that African countries make in their various international trade, and investment relations that they are establishing, will be quite critical, for this exercise. Because in the end, it's also a factor in your capacity for strengthening domestic capital accumulation and savings. Because with all this growth also, savings rates are still pretty poor, partly because of the ownership of assets and also the pattern of things. If you take the mineral sector, what has come out in the past decade of the mineral boom is that while prices have gone up incredibly, very little of the increased revenue has remained in African countries as a contribution to their to accumulation process and therefore to investment. So these are all factors which have a bearing.
If we think of the future of the African state as largely democratic, loosely speaking, where you have basically elected regimes, whether parliamentary or presidential, that really poses the question of whether or not you can build a coalition, political coalition of forces which would favor development, which would be able to have what in the old days might have been called a national democratic kind of agenda, or national developmental agenda. Is that something which is politically feasible in this day and age? And what kinds of trade-offs would be involved in terms of what kinds of coalitions could be built involving the major social groupings in society?
Yeah, I think the question about the liberalization of politics and the national democratic character of policy choices is an extremely important issue, because the transformation agenda that we're talking about, both in terms of an agrarian transition as well as the reconstruction of the state, which allows it to implement policies for the majority, it's something which has come into severe question over the past 2 decades since political liberalization. I think in many African countries, I mean, the euphoria of being able to elect your leaders has worn off as electoral politics has degenerated primarily really into intra-elite, kind of circulation around a common agenda where people increasingly feel that these liberalized electoral politics, which I hesitate to call democratic government, really are choiceless democracies. So that recognition of the choicelessness means that there's a contestation about the nature of the party political process. I mean, most of the parties don't have any research departments which are looking at development options which will inform them when they come to power. They are primarily kind of vote gathering machines utilizing any form of patronage, whether it's ethnicity, bribing voters, old student networks, religion, and so on. So the transcending of this kind of politics is a precondition for the possibility of electoral politics becoming a vehicle for a national development, national democratic development agenda. But I think if you look at the way the kind of issues which are being raised by different social movements, even if across Africa, by and large, they have not become strong enough to represent a consistent and sustained challenge, okay, a unified challenge where people who are looking for gender equality and gender equity, have a common purpose with people coming from the agricultural community who are interested in choices in rural development, with trade unions to build a broad, national change alliance. In their various fragments and demands, you can see the elements that would have to be addressed. You can see constituencies coalescing around the different elements of the national democratic agenda. And I think in a way, the real democratization of politics would also be the process of these demands becoming so overwhelming that the party political process itself, the electoral process itself, reforms in response to this, or its crisis could lead, to some kind of reversals, of the liberalization process. But I'm quite optimistic also that many African countries, people remember that the kind of authoritarian politics that they experienced led, in most cases, to regression, okay, in terms of development and their conditions. I mean, there are outstanding leaders in the African context who, in their social and developmental vision, people remember fondly. So if you take my own country, Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah is an icon across the continent. But there are critical points about the politics of his regime. But when people put that in the balance, they remember that in totality, this man embodied the kind of vision of society that they wanted. So there's enough of that remembrance for people to want to harvest the positives from people like Nkrumah and try to avoid the mistakes that they made. And I think, as we see the limits of this kind of choiceless democracies, the recognition even that the kind of the capture of policy space by external agencies, either through aid or various agreements, is beginning, to generate questioning. And in Ghana here in recent times, we've had a kind of really startling development around the national debate about whether or not to sign an economic partnership agreement, with the European Union. We've been campaigning on this question for the past 10 years, and I've been surprised by just how around this end game, when it looks like the deal is done and the politicians are in agreement that we have no choice, there's an uproar. There's an uproar. And the uproar is not only about the EPAs, but it's become symptomatic of the sense that political leaders are not representing the people.
if I can be slightly cynical, it seems to me the optimism of your will and the pessimism of your intellect are contradictory. Your analysis seems to suggest that on the one hand that we have choiceless democracies which are somehow going to lead us into developmental coalitions which will eventually triumph. What?
No, I'm saying that as people, the euphoria of electing your leaders, where people are seeing the limits of simply voting, and they are beginning to ask questions about what is the purpose. We expect jobs, we expect better education for our children, we expect housing. Okay, as they pose those questions, those are precisely the drivers of all kinds of new kind of coalitions and organizations which are emerging, which I agree with you entirely that it is not a short-term thing. It requires the coalescence of all these different forces into a sustained and broad questioning social movement for this thing to shift. But I also recognize that it's not only domestic forces who have a vested interest in this model. There are also external, influences in this model. Okay, so it's a huge challenge. But you're right that there's an optimism that people will come around. But I'm entirely in agreement with you that the size of the task is huge. But I mean, I remember reading a book about the Gold Coast, which was written in 1947, which celebrated the adoption of a new colonial constitution. And the foreword said that once again, the Gold Coast has set the path for the rest, of British Africa. And they were looking forward to the replication of this colonial constitution across the continent. They didn't know that somebody called Kwame Nkrumah had returned to the country. Within a few months, we had the riots. And within 3 years, the Gold Coast colony had become the first independent, self-governing colony in Africa. Even the Ghanaian elite were surprised. They wanted independence, but they wanted it in the shortest possible time. And they kept writing petitions to the king. When the masses erupted, they wanted it now. And suddenly you had this shift, in the balance of forces. So the need to continue to work to build those forces, to raise the questions, also means that even within the elite, people begin to ask questions. Okay, in the work that we've been doing, I mean, in recent times, the Association of Ghana Industry has become one of our strongest allies in the fight against the free trade agreement, because they too want space to invest their capital, to accumulate capital, and become big entrepreneurs like those who are coming to squeeze them out. So all kinds of alliances are emerging, and across the continent, you see certain things. If you take something like the African Mining Vision that we've been working on, this started as an initiative of technocrats at the continental level. Now, they did as a deductive thing. Prices have gone up, countries are not getting enough. We need to make a demand for minerals to make a stronger contribution to the continent's development. So we want a more holistic role for minerals. Now, they finished with that to the extent that the ministers adopted the resolutions. Okay? Unlike the past, where it would just have sat there. Because there are groups in society who have more space to speak and act. I'm going off to Joburg tonight. We're having a workshop with trade unionists about why the African Mining Vision represents an opportunity to make some larger demands. So this is how the interplay of intra-elite policy making can be taken beyond how people envision it. It's a tough business, but anytime you get out of bed in the morning, it's because you think you can do something different.
On that very optimistic note, Yao Graham of the Third World Network, Africa Network, let me thank you very much.
Thank you.
20 minutes.